Well, good morning. Today we're going to talk a little bit, mostly towards the end of this, about anti-Zionism, which seems to be, in my view, one of the most, in, I guess, a harbinger of the end times because it seems to be growing, and it's happening at virtually every level of culture, society, and geopolitics. As you know, here we talk about the convergence of these signs, these things that the Lord has said and the prophets have said will be indicative of the end times and how they all seem to be converging at a point. And this slide has sort of some of the markers of things that we look at. For example, if you see here in the second column, there's a slide that's made up of some of the rail cars and going into Auschwitz, because that's a sign of the end times, a rampant anti-Semitism. And we know, unfortunately, from Scripture, it says that when the Antichrist in the screen there, just to the right of the Auschwitz, that there will be a great tribulation after the middle part of the 70th week that will come upon the Jewish people, the time of Jacob, which I think is the time of Jacob's trouble, and it'll be terrible. Now, the ultimate end of that is the salvation of the Jewish people, and that'll be great and glorious. So we watch these signs, and I want to clarify some things. We get a lot of comments now on our YouTube channel or by email. One of the things we're trying to do here is to inform people about the things that are going on, kind of look at the things that are going on in news, culture, and the world from a biblical perspective so that you can understand what's going on. Because I think understanding the times, identifying the signs and that sort of thing is an important thing in the end times. But we know that the battle that rages, the things that we see going on, and the fact that they seem to be disconnected from reality is not it's not a physical battle that we're in. We're in a spiritual battle. In Ephesians chapter 6, Paul, closing out his letter to the Corinthians, said, "Finally, my brethren," verse 10, "Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Wherefore take unto you the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all to stand." And we do live, I think there's no question that we live in evil days. And we have to remember that the weapon to fight against that, to stand, to be defensive against that, is the Word of God, the armor of God, the whole armor of God. And the foundation of that, of course, is the belt of truth. In Daniel chapter 9, there's a great prophecy, and I've mentioned this a number of times, but just listen to what Daniel says. Now, Daniel, he's in Babylon, and he's reading the scroll of Jeremiah. And he reads Jeremiah, and he says, wait a minute, this captivity is only supposed to last 70 years. So, does Daniel pack his bags? No. He prays. Listen to what he does. "And I set my face unto the Lord God," Daniel chapter 9, verse 3, "and I set my face unto the Lord God to seek by prayer and supplications with fasting and sackcloth and ashes. And I prayed unto the Lord my God and made my confession." Now, Daniel was a righteous man, but he still got on his knees and he repented before God. "And I prayed unto the Lord my God and made my confession and said, O Lord, the great and dreadful God, keeping the covenant and mercy to them that love him and to them that keep his commandments. We have sinned and have committed iniquity and have done wickedly and have rebelled, even by departing from thy precepts and from thy judgments. Neither have we hearkened unto thy servants the prophets, which spake in thy name to our kings, our princes, and our fathers, and to all the people of the land. Neither have we obeyed the voice of the Lord our God to walk in his laws, which he set before us by his servants the prophets. Yea, all Israel have transgressed thy law, even by departing, that they might not obey thy voice. Therefore, the curse is poured upon us, and the oath that is written in the law of Moses, the servant of God, because we have sinned against him. And if you go to Deuteronomy and other passages, you will find that if they didn't keep the commandments, they were going to be punished by the Lord. But we also know from passages such as Ezekiel 35 and 36 that God is going to bring them back because God's name's at stake, not because they deserve it. Verse 12, Daniel 9, and he hath confirmed his words, which he spake against us and against our judges that judged us, by bringing upon us a great evil. For under the whole earth heaven hath not done as hath been done upon Jerusalem. As it is written in the law of Moses, all this evil is come upon us, yet made we not our prayer before the Lord our God, that we might turn from our iniquities and understand thy truth. Therefore hath the Lord watched upon the evil and brought it upon us. For the Lord our God is righteous in all his works which he doeth. For we obeyed not his voice. And now, O Lord our God, thou hast brought thy people forth out of the land of Egypt with a mighty hand, and hast gotten thee renown. As at this day we have sinned, we have done wickedly. O Lord, according to all thy righteousness, I beseech thee. And so what he prays is not, okay, he says essentially, Lord, fulfill the prophecies that you've said. And I think this is a good example of how we ought to be praying in these days. O Lord, according to all thy righteousness, I beseech thee, let thine anger and thy fury be turned away from the city Jerusalem, the holy mountain, because for our sins and for the iniquities of our fathers, Jerusalem and thy people are become a reproach to all that are about us. Now therefore, O Lord our God, hear the prayer of thy servant and his supplications, and cause thy face to shine upon thy sanctuary that is desolate, for the Lord's sake. O my God, incline thine ear and hear, and open thine eyes, and behold our desolations, and the city which is called by thy name. For we do not present our supplications before thee for our righteousnesses, but for thy great mercies. O Lord, hear, O Lord, forgive, O Lord, hearken and do. Defer not for thy own sake, O my God, for thy city and thy people called by thy name. And in Daniel chapter 10, the following chapter, it talks about the fact that he is in a spiritual battle. And he prays for 21 days. And he's visited by an angel, and comes and says, Then he said unto me, Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that thou didst set thine heart to understand and to chasten thyself before thy God, thy words were heard, and I am come for thy words. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. But lo, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, and I remained there with the kings of Persia. And so that should be our prayer. Lord, fulfill your prophecies just as they are. But we need to recognize that we live in a time in which I think the process of that protection that God has had on the world and in various countries and cultures is being pulled back, so that man will have that opportunity to do what he wants. He can turn away from God, or he can turn to God through Jesus Christ. And that's what we're seeing unfold in our day. And I'll admit to you, it's very troubling at times to watch all the things that are going on. It is, it does seem some days that the news is all bad. Now, I'll talk about it in just a moment. D.C. hunkers down as the storm hits. So D.C. is shut down. And I'm kind of have mixed emotions about that. Okay? And really, did anybody's life get worse the last couple days? I mean, okay, I'm sorry, all you people who live in D.C., but it's just snow. It'll melt eventually. And eventually, my niece and her husband lived down in Martinsburg, West Virginia, and they got somewhere between around 36 to 40 inches at their place. And it's going to take a while. They don't have the equipment that we have. I grew up and went to high school in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and we used to get, now in Pennsylvania, they weren't like Ohio. You had a certain number of days of instruction, and if you missed a day for snow day, you went in June. So nobody wanted to go in June. So we would get 8 or 10 inches of snow overnight and still have school the next day. But we had a lot of equipment. We had a lot of hills, so people knew how to handle it and everything. Well, they don't have that kind of equipment there, so how long it's going to take them to get out. But the story that how long it's going to take them to get out, who knows, but pray for them. And like I said, eventually everything will be back to normal. One of the things here in the Washington Post this morning, though, is this story, women warned over Zika outbreak. I don't know if you heard about this story down in Brazil and Latin America and South America. They're actually encouraging women. There's a mosquito-borne virus, and it's causing birth defects, a big spike in birth defects with people getting infected with it. It's also causing, in healthy people, it's causing some what appear to be psychological problems. It's a very serious thing, and they're actually encouraging women not to have babies in South America until they can get a handle on this thing. It comes from mosquitoes. And it's working its way up through Central America and eventually through airplane travel and that type of thing. It'll be here in the United States before too long. Here's some economic news from the Investors Business Daily. Social Security Trust Fund fell for the first time since 1983, but look at what it says below that. Fund runs dry in 2029. Social Security out of money. But don't worry, I'm sure a bipartisan effort will take place in the halls of Congress with the cooperation of whoever is president, and everything will be just fine. And yeah, I know, I also have a bridge that I can sell you too. Plunging oil prices, this is just one example of the news this week. It's causing worker unrest in Russia. Russia is heavily dependent on the sale of oil and gas for its budget. It has a huge budget shortfall. It had a huge budget shortfall because prices had already fell a ways last year. I think they need oil to be selling at about $60 a barrel. It's now down to 26. It could go as low as 10. Russia is running out of money. They're cutting back on services. They're cutting back on pensions. That's causing unrest. China's economy is collapsing, and this is having a snowball effect all over the world. Here's another article I just saw this morning from Zero Hedge. And again, I will warn you, I look at Zero Hedge, but if you're prone to depression or suicidal thoughts, don't go read Zero Hedge, okay? But it is a good place that gathers a lot of the financial news. There's also a lawyer named Michael Snyder who has a thing, and you should know what he talks about because the name of his blog is called the Economic Collapse Blog. So, but that's another good place to go for some of this information. War on cash escalates. China readies digital currency. International Monetary Fund says that it would be extremely beneficial. And there's this push from central banks and governments around the world to get rid of physical cash. I mean, now I go to the store, and now I see this thing for Apple Pay. And I can just tap my phone and I can pay with my credit card. Never have to take money out of my wallet. But part of the reason I think that they're doing that, and I think Zero Hedge analysis of this is correct, they're taking away physical cash because they want to have the ability to do. It'll be easier for them to do what they call bail-ins. Remember what they did in Cyprus? They just said, okay, you got money in the bank. We're taking 45% of everything over $20,000 because we need the money. And so it's just this one time. Well, I'm going to do it one time. You know how government is. We're going to have an income tax for a year or two, and then we'll go back to normal. And how'd that work out? Not too well. So you just need to be prepared for that this is coming. I have no advice on how to protect your assets. I'm trying to figure out how to protect some that we have. There are ways to do it, but you need to get the advice of a professional. In this news, the United Methodist Church. Now, the United Methodist Church has, for the most part, and I'm not saying every United Methodist Church or every United Methodist person is apostate. okay? I'm sure there are good, faithful United Methodist churches, good, faithful United Methodist Church members, but the church organization is apostate. They've supported same-sex marriage, and now there was this at Evolution News and Discovery.org. The Discovery Institute wanted to put a table up at the United Methodist General Conference, and so the people in charge of the United Methodist Church got together and they said, no, we're not going to let you talk about intelligent design. We're not going to let you even display your books at our conference. It's interesting, though, if you look at the United Methodist website, it says this, okay, so they're banning the discussion of intelligent design. I mean, not even creationism, just the discussion of intelligent design. But look at what it says on the what we believe part of the United Methodist website. It says this: the United Methodist Church is a 12.3 million strong global church that what? Opens hearts, opens minds, and opens doors through active engagement with our world. They're liars. They lie. They're not about open minds. They're as closed. They're fascists in many respects. They don't want to hear that God created the universe. Because why? Well, you know, you see this track happens. We stop believing in creation, and now we don't believe in marriage between a man and a woman, or vice versa. One generally follows the other. I think it's almost a given that if you believe in one, you're going to believe. If you believe that marriage can be between two men or two women, you're going to believe that we just came from nothing. This is a map in the New York Times this week that's kind of interesting, showing, and this sort of has an end times implication to it because there's talk about in Revelation about people being given over to sorcery, which is really, the word there is pharmakia, pharmacy, drugs. This is the growth in addiction to, you know, heroin and oxycodone and that type of thing from 2002 to 2014 in the United States. And so as it gets more yellow and orange, that is an indicator of high addiction rates within those particular counties. So here's a little better map. This is what it looked like in 2002, and this is what it looked like a couple years ago. You see how the increase of that addiction in the United States has increased? We have a major problem. There were also reports this week that despite what the White House says, I know it's hard to believe that the White House may not tell you the truth, that there is a murder wave going on in the United States. They even had a meeting about it. They brought in a lot of mayors because the mayors and police chiefs have been complaining that because of certain protest movements against everything that they do, they're not doing the policing that they did. And the Obama administration said, oh, that's just not true. There's no statistics to prove it. Well, now guess what? They released the stats this week. They released the stats this, you know, I know people, they write in, they say, you don't say nuclear correctly, and I'm from the Midwest, that's how we say it, get over it. And I have these parts of my brain, hard drive, where they doesn't work well. So I'm sorry. So anyway, back to bad news. There has been an increase in murder. And they brought in the police chiefs to the White House, and they said, there's no statistics. Well, now the stats have been released, and they say there is a problem. This is a growing problem. And they had a closed-door meeting. They were very strict about who could get into it, but a Washington Post reporter did get into it and reported that even Rahm Emanuel, who used to be the chief of staff of President Obama, said, listen, with the way this is going, the police have essentially pulled themselves into a fetal position, and they're not even investigating gang slayings and that type of thing. Now, when your former chief of staff is saying something like that, there's a problem. And the Obama administration says, well, you really can't draw conclusions from the statistics. Got that one right. I looked at, I read a lot of different publications. I just looked at foreign policy late last night and early this morning, and I just pulled off some headlines of the stories that are on that website. I don't agree with everything that's said there, obviously, but I'm just pointing out to you what secular people are looking at from a geopolitical standpoint. Look at what these articles were just on the front page. Obama is Poland's only hope. Okay, that's what it says. Good luck, Poland. Here's another one. You don't even think about this. I mean, Africa is this enormous continent. South Sudan's next civil war is starting. That has implications prophetic-wise because of some of the descriptions of the people in the coalition that come against Israel in Ezekiel 38 and 39. Here's Sisi's fracturing regime. Egypt's strongman is cracking down ahead of the 5th anniversary of the revolution, but the real threat he faces isn't from protests. Internally, Egypt is in a mess. Now, I don't have time to go into it, but you also need to know that there are prophecies, I think rather specific prophecies, about all of the Arab states. And there will be in the end, there will be a glorious revival in those states. But they're going to be devastated from God's judgment. But there will be a remnant of people saved out of almost every one of those countries. There are specific prophecies about Egypt, Iran, and other Arab countries. So there is hope there, but there's a bad part before we get there. So Egypt is really having a lot of problems. In Central Asia, in what we lovingly refer to here as the Stan republics, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and other names that I can't say or spell very well, a perfect storm in Central Asia because they're heavily dependent on oil, and they were formerly in the Soviet Union, and Russia's economic crisis is having an impact on them. They're heavily Muslim, Muslim majority countries. And so what's Russia going to do? Because Russia wants to keep them at bay. Russia has a Muslim problem itself. They're collapsing demographically. Another story in the Middle East, Chinese president in Tehran for the first visit in 14 years. And I also saw an article this week, I don't have a copy of it up here, that was from a secular think tank, and it was talking about the fact that we have a problem with unmarried males in Europe right now. They're running amok. And I think it's pretty clear, I think most men, if they're honest, would agree that marriage civilizes you to a large degree. The problem is in China, which we've talked about because of their demographics, because of their one-child policy, in India because of their demographics and because of their sex selection favoring males, those two countries are going to have pretty soon 200 million unmarried males. What are you going to do with do you understand? Look at what's happening in Europe with 1 million or 2. Now multiply that by 100. I personally think that's related to this Kings of the East prophecy of the end times. Melanie Phillips, you ought to look up her article the other day, Friday, in the Jerusalem Post, Iran for Dummies, because now we've released $100 billion to Iran, and even Josh Earnest, by the way, Obama free Sunday. Hillary Clinton free Sunday. Josh Earnest free Sunday. No clips, so you won't have to. I'm going to tell you some of what they said. Josh Earnest the other day said, well, yeah, we know they're going to spend it on terrorism. We knew that all along. But, we're going to be nice to them so they won't do anything to us. Oh, by the way, one of the leading clerics of Iran today said, hey, guess what? America is still the great Satan. So I think they're right on our side. And this is also in foreign policy. The war for Islam. Amid a rolling Middle East, Iran and Saudi Arabia are fanning the fires of sectarianism and playing politics in a zero-sum proxy war of religious fervor. This gentleman, Seth Frantzman, in the Jerusalem Post the other day, wrote this, "The Middle East New Old 30 Years War." Now, what happened was, after President Obama's State of the Union, and here's a surprise, I actually kind of agreed with something that he said in his State of the Union address. So mark it down, January 24th, 1126, Haller agreed with Obama that these problems in the Middle East are over a millennia old. They're over 1,000 years old. Well, what happened was all these secular professors of history and religion and commentators came out and said, wait a minute, it's not old. This is recent. This is because of us. And they're wrong. And so this man does a great thing in his article. So he cites this Vox World article by Max Fisher that says, Obama's cringeworthy line claiming Middle East conflicts date back millennia. And Fisher goes into this. He says, as I pointed out on Twitter before realizing that every PhD in my feed had beat me to it, the idea that Middle East conflicts date back millennia is straight up factually wrong. These people don't know history. They're the teachers the kids get in college. The Middle East conflicts almost date to within the past century, and many have roots within Obama's own lifetime. For example, most scholars date the start of today's Sunni-Shia sectarian conflict not to the 7th century, but rather to various events from 1979 onward. It's just a complete bold-faced lie. The man is an ignoramus. Islamist extremism is mostly a modern revisionist phenomenon that is a reaction to specific modern-day events, such as the Arab-Israeli conflicts and the 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and so on. Go tell that to the 80 million Indians that were slaughtered in the Muslim invasion of India. 80 million. It's insanity. This in Jerusalem Post article says, according to all these experts, commentators, and people with PhDs, anyone who implies the Middle East has ancient hatreds is playing into a racist view that sees religion as brutish and savage merely because it is different. This narrative pegs all the problems of the region on treaties like Sykes-Picot in 1916, 100 years ago, that catered to the European interests rather than the locals. It's clear why any challenge to this myth in the ivory tower would be toxic, for it would go against the Eurocentric view that all the world's problems boil down to European colonialism. People would do well to stop pretending the Middle East is something other than what it is. It is a place of ancient hatreds and incredible intolerance, not unprecedented in human history, but with much in common with the darkest periods of human history. And he goes on to compare it to the Middle Ages and the 30 Years' War, the religious wars that took place in Israel. And then this last article from Foreign Policy is The Last Temptation of Barack Obama and John Kerry. Despite all sense and reason, the President and Secretary of State have one more go at Middle East peace. And so I'm going to focus on that a little bit and then some of the things that went on at the Davos. But let me get back to this terrorism thing. Remember, I cited you to this New America Foundation report from their international security arm that said deadly attacks since 9/11. Violent jihadist attacks, 45. Right-wing attacks, 48. So you need to fear right-wing extremists more than you do jihadists. And what's wrong with that? It's made-up statistics. They ignored 3,000 people killed on 9/11. If you put 3,000 people in there, 2,900, whatever it was, the ratio then changes. Oh, and by the way, and this is taught in colleges. Here's a professor, I don't know if you can hear this, he's talking a little bit about, he puts up this slide and says, since 9/11, most terrorist attacks in the U.S. have been perpetrated by white Caucasian men. And he has, of course, the guy there in the raft with the beer. And this is a little bit of what he said.
90% are from these white Caucasian men. And by the way, I'm not saying white men are evil, but That's what we should be thinking about. Usually they're people who are religiously motivated and politically conservative. And these are the type of people we always think of being like really against terrorism. Most are, but these are also people who kind of fall off the wayside, probably do things like mental illness, and then do things that are called terrorism and are terrorism.
And again, if you take the totals, in fact, a professor down in Florida actually looked at it. He says, look, if you include this in, it's not an even ratio or a little bit more towards right-wing extremists. The ratio is 62-1. And you have to count all the attacks that were foiled by law enforcement, the shoe bombers on the plane and all these other people that were going to attack malls even here locally. So it's a problem. Somebody shared this with me recently. They went to a book fair at their school, elementary school, public school, here in Ohio, and this book was for sale, targeted by Scholastic.com towards K through 12, or K through second graders, Golden Domes and Silver Lanterns, a Muslim book of colors. I wonder, are they allowed to sell Christian books? But this is, and I've seen pictures of all the young kids in the classroom bowing and praying towards Mecca, and the teacher standing there smiling, 3 of them. I just saw this picture. This is happening all over the country. Well, I want to focus a little bit on the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos, Switzerland. A lot of people there. Benjamin Netanyahu was there with the lady who's the European Secretary for Foreign Secretary. There was he also met with John Kerry. There was a big cybersecurity meeting that took place. There were a number of panels. I'll play a couple clips from them because this is interesting. The world in 2030. Now, you remember back last year in October, November, we talked about what was going on in the UN. And they came out with their Sustainable Development Goals for what year? 2030. So the agenda among the elites and geopolitics seems to be, hey, let's get everything perfect by 2030. So these guys, the guy on the left is technology executive. The lady on the right, the far lady on the right, she's an attorney and scientist. Lady on the left is the moderator. She's an editor for The Economist magazine. So just listen to a little bit of what they say because I think it brings together a lot of Bible prophecy themes.
And this is an extraordinarily important and interesting subject. Life in 2030. I think you don't need me to tell you that we are on the brink of a revolution, technologically. I believe the World Economic Forum likes to call it the 4th industrial revolution. It's the convergence of many things, artificial intelligence, genome editing, big data, all manner of things together. And what we're going to talk about tonight, we're going to do a little futurology. We're going to ask this extraordinarily distinguished panel, what do they think will be the game-changing technologies? How precisely will these technologies change life? What are the, if any, social, moral, ethical concerns we might have, and how do we make sure these technologies change life for the better? But before we do that, I wanted to get a sense of the optimism or pessimism about technology in the room. So I wanted to, in a show of hands, to see whether you think life will be better or worse in 2030. Will you raise your hand if you think life will be better in 2030 than it is today?
And so they had about half everybody said life would be better. And these are the people in charge, okay? Now we're going to hear a little discussion that takes place on the panel about some issues. The guy on the left, he's a tech executive. I don't know what company he's with, but he's like, we're going to do interplanetary travel, and we're going to talk to the aliens, and we're going to go mine asteroids and that type of thing. Can't clear the streets in Washington, D.C. for a week, but we're going to go mine an asteroid. Okay, I mean, it could happen. It's theoretically possible. Look, I'm not big on a lot of conspiracy theories because I hope nobody here works for the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, but that's the one everybody has to deal with. It's much better than it used to be. Remember years ago, you go to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, And I'm like, I don't see this vast conspiracy. They can't even get the license plate thing right, you know? So, but they're trying. They are trying. So here's a discussion on this panel.
It raises the question of what it means to be human. How much of the brain-computer interface and how much of the cooperation between human and machines do we get to before we...
Now, listen, they think we're nuts, right? So they're talking about cyborgs. And they want to do this.
start to lose something that is what we think the essence of what it means to be us today? And I don't have a good answer to that question because we've already incorporated so much technology into our lives, and we evolve what we think it means to be human. And again, I'm an optimist who believes that we will find a way, but can you get to a point where you end up taking away so much of humanity that the subjective, compassionate pieces that allow us to interconnect as a society get traded off for efficiency and other types of calculations that...
And it's not a rhetorical question. The answer is yes. You do lose your humanity by doing this.
diminish the flourishing of being a human.
Humanity is becoming more and more powerful. First we had fire, it burned us, we learned how to use that. You know, many generations ahead we figured out how to harness the power of the atom. It's both our most destructive force, but it's also a force that keeps people warm and powers, you know, half the world, whatever the number is. Mm-hmm. The same is true of all these other things. They require rules. And again, the rules better be there pretty quickly because we're reaching the point where the acceleration in all of these areas of technology is on Moore's law. When hardware problems become software problems, when all companies are software companies, it's all accelerating at Moore's law. And so we see these horrible things that happen, but we're less at war now than we've ever been. We're healthier, we live longer. There's a lot of great things that come. And we're only talking about, 13, 14, 15 years from now. The chances are that all of these technologies, just like everyone has said, are going to make people's lives better more than they're going to make people's lives worse. Now, if we're talking 100 years, we don't even know what kind of, we may not even be humans anymore, right? We might be computer-human mixes or have discovered extraterrestrial life or had an asteroid hit the Earth. Who knows? But over the term period that we're talking about, which I think we need to confine ourselves to, it's going to make our lives better, more than likely.
Well, I read the book, and there is something that hits the Earth. So, I mean, don't diss Bible prophecy because it sounds fanciful. These things are being discussed at the highest level of the elites of our business world, our cultural world, our geopolitical world. And there are dozens of hours of these meetings that I'm only giving you a small snippet of what was talked about. One of the things that was talked about was the future of Europe. Now look, there's a branch of Bible prophecy that believes that Europe is the final big beast empire and it'll rise from the ashes. It's falling apart. It's not going well. So they had a panel to talk about this. There was a foreign minister from the Netherlands. You'll hear him in a moment. There was the new prime minister of Greece, Tsipras. He was there. And so I'm just going to play a little bit of what the panel talked about.
And I think the reality today, as many of us would recognize, is that the EU has become a microcosm of many of the world's most pressing problems, whether it be the threat of terrorism, whether it be an unstable neighborhood driven by the dangers of geopolitics as well as failing states and lack of good governance, whether it's dramatic flows of migrants and refugees, slow growth, high debt, the rise of populist parties, and I suppose I need to say it here as the Brit, the possible threat of a Brexit, of an exit of the UK from the EU, a difficult and very specific distraction.
And then he goes on, he talks a little bit about this report that was issued and circulated at Davos called Europe, What to Watch Out For in 2016 and 2017. I think they talk about it in this clip.
The EU seems to be moving from one emergency to the next. Europe's leaders are in crisis-fighting mode. Reactive, improvising, often uncoordinated, but, and it would say this, ultimately partially successful, or modestly successful.
And it goes on to show some statistics from this report. What are the biggest problems that you think are facing EU at the moment? And it shows the trend from spring to autumn. And migration, of course, is almost 60%. 6 out of 10 think that migration is a problem. 25% think that terrorism is. And those are up significantly from what they were just a year before. There are overwhelming concerns about unemployment and the economic situation. The report talks about migration. It says this: Europe needs migrant workers to compensate for the decline of its own working age population. We've talked a lot about that here, demographic decline, which threatens to undermine social welfare systems and public finances. In addition to integrating newly arriving refugees, European countries will also have to facilitate legal economic migration. For example, through a workable regime of blue cards, which are EU, they're similar to our green cards here in the United States. How fundamentally Europe's external environment has changed is illustrated by the EU's own strategy statements. When the EU first released a European security strategy in 2003, it stated, "Europe has never been so prosperous, so secure, or so free. The violence of the first half of the 20th century has given way to a period of peace and stability unprecedented in European history. Everything is great. We're evolving just as we planned." By 2015, when the EU High Representative for Foreign Policy started working on a new global strategy, she acknowledged, you saw her picture with Benjamin Netanyahu, she acknowledged that the world and our perception of it has become more dangerous, divided, and disorienting. Hopes that the stability of the EU would radiate and promote stability in its surroundings have given way to fears that the EU is importing instability in the form of refugees and terrorism. Boy, she's right. Few, if any, predicted the military adventurism of Russia, either towards Ukraine or in Syria, and practically all of the assumptions underlying Western policies in the Middle East since the Arab Spring have been proven wrong. She's the foreign policy chief of the EU who's saying this. Today, a revisionist Russia in the East and a multifaceted meltdown of large parts of the Middle East and the South presents Europe with foreign and security policy challenges of almost unprecedented complexity. Much of the EU's credibility and weight in the future will depend on how it handles its immediate external challenges. The starting point is not particularly propitious. The EU has not managed to build a strong and coherent common foreign and security policy. On the contrary, EU countries have often gone alone in recent years. NATO, meanwhile, faces its own challenges. The NATO summit scheduled for July 2016 will have to grapple with demands primarily from the alliance's Central and Eastern European members for a stronger deterrence posture. Although most NATO countries have stopped slashing their military budgets, most are still far off the agreed target of spending 2% of their GDP on defense. Europe is not a military superpower anymore. It exists in large part because Americans have projected military power there. So then it goes on to talk about the State of the Union in 2016, two scenarios. So they do sort of a war game thing. How is this going to work out? Here's just some quotes. One is, what if everything goes wrong? I'm only bringing part of this up too because people say, John, you're so negative. I'm like, listen to what the leaders of the world are talking about, folks. If you think everything is okay, you are not paying attention. So if everything goes wrong, they cited an example, frustrated by what happens between now and 2030, frustrated by the EU's weakness and indecisiveness, it took President Hillary Clinton until 2020 before she made her first visit across the Atlantic. That's a frightening prospect. And it says, everything's going to fall apart. The EU is going to fall apart. We're going to fracture. We're going to put back in what they call the Schengen zone, where they have essentially they've had borderless travel. It's now they're like, well, maybe we can do it internally, but we need to put a wall around the outside of the Schengen zone. If all goes right, the EU's new global strategy for foreign and security policy, agreed in 2016, turned out to be more than words. Faced with serious external threats, European governments pooled their efforts to give more robust support to Ukraine while also helping. Now, how are they going to do this? They're in abject financial crisis. This is pie in the sky stuff. It's theoretically possible. I cannot exclude that, okay? But they don't have the money. And they're importing people that are fracturing their societies. Faced with serious external threats, European governments pooled their efforts to give more robust support to Ukraine while also helping to stabilize the situation in and around Syria through buffer zones and large-scale aid. Turkey, flattered by its prominent position in the global strategy, joined these efforts. The prospect of, listen, there's biblical prophecy and then there's these guys, okay? The prospect of peace and improved conditions in the refugee camps in Lebanon and Jordan helped to slow the flow of people into Europe. This allowed EU countries to devote more resources to helping new arrivals find jobs and integrate into local communities. The Not in My Name campaign against extremism that brought together Muslims in over 20 EU countries also helped to take the wind out of the sail of the anti-immigrant politicians. They also talk about the euro's fast-growing role as a global reserve currency. The euro is collapsing. See these reports, European doors quickly closing to migrants. So at the same time they're talking about all this optimistic stuff and pessimistic stuff, the reality is there's a ton of migrants still coming to the EU. Angela Merkel, she even got on and said, you know what we're also finding is that we brought in all of these refugees, anti-Semitism is really growing. We're surprised at that. Shouldn't be surprising. So what does the richest man in the world think we ought to do here in the United States about migration?
I think the U.S. Should set a better example by taking more refugees in. We should have the capacity. Even though it's not easy, I think Germany and Sweden are to be congratulated for being more of an open door approach on this thing. The total number of refugees is not like a world record. The political sensitivity about refugees and the tightness of the budgets is what making this one particularly acute.
Well, I've seen pictures of his house, 50, 60,000. When he takes 1,000 in, then he can get up there and pontificate, right? And you know what? And sidebar comment, all these people say, oh, we need to contribute more to taxes and stuff. Write a check to the government, Bill. Go ahead and write a check. You got $60, $80 billion, go ahead. Or let's enact a one-time tax, wealth tax. Anything above $2 billion, 90% goes to the government. You think those guys would stand for it for a second? They're George Soros, all these guys, they're frauds. Here are some comments about Facebook. They came out and said, well, we're gonna shut down hate speech, and here's the COO of Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg.
Well, I know what Facebook does, which is there's no place for hate and intolerance or calls for violence on our platform, and we do everything we can to take all of it down, not just the posts and the calls for violence, but the people who are perpetrators of it. They're off Facebook. That said, there continues to be a lot of hate, and we all know as soon as you take something down, another one pops up. I was just in Berlin. We announced the Online Civil Courage Initiative. It's a partnership between Facebook, the German government, and academic researchers and NGOs. And the idea is, what can we do? Well, the best antidote to bad speech is good speech. The best antidote to hate is tolerance. Well, I know what Facebook does, which...
Well, what she said was, there was somebody posted about ISIS and recruiting for ISIS. So about 100 people got on and liked the post, even though they really didn't like it, and that kind of shut down the discussion. So posting likes on hate sites is what's going to solve the problems in the world. Okay. Here's a report now about what's the migrant crisis going to do. Here's the Netherlands foreign minister in this discussion.
You put at the top of your list of priorities for the Dutch presidency of the European Council a comprehensive approach to migration and international security. And at the heart of that, I imagine, is going to have to be rethinking Schengen. I think it was Jean-Claude Juncker who said Schengen kind of is Europe. And yet, if Schengen is Europe, how could European leaders have developed a system for open borders internally without a system for stronger external borders on the outside? This was a fair weather policy, it strikes me, and rather dangerous to put fair weather policies at the heart of Europe. What do you think can be done in the near term? Donald Tusk has talked about 2 months to get things organized. What can be done in the near term to manage another year?
Well, first of all, I am in complete agreement with Donald Tusk that we need to get a grip on this issue in the next 6 to 8 weeks. And the reason is that when spring comes and the numbers of refugees coming out of Turkey and Lebanon and other countries through Greece into the rest of the European Union, through the West Balkans, we see today that in the first 3 weeks of this year, there were 35,000 people crossing the sea from Turkey into Greece. Last year, it was only 1,600 in the full month of January. Now 35,000 in the first 3 weeks of this year, and this is winter. So when spring comes, and the numbers will quadruple, it will go up considerably, we cannot, as a European Union, at least for the Netherlands, for Germany, for other countries, we cannot cope with the numbers any longer. So we have to get a grip on this. So this is the immediate agenda for the next 6 to 8 weeks. This has to do with making a success of the EU-Turkish agreement, making a success of building the hotspots and the reception facilities in Greece and in Italy, making a success of the relocation system within the European Union. Your question is about Schengen. I mean, Schengen is crucial. A lot of our wealth, of our economic potential has to do with the fact that we have open borders. But we do also have a system called Dublin. The Dublin system has to do with how we deal with the influx of migrants into the European Union. And that Dublin system at the moment is not working. So before we kill Schengen, we first have to make Dublin work.
Okay, so you hear what he says. We can't cope with this right now, and we have 6 to 8 weeks to get it right. Think through the implications of that. This is one of the top European government people. So I don't know. You know, it'll be interesting. It'll be an interesting spring. This is I talked a little bit about this last week. The man, his name is Nawi, who in that video that I referred you to, I think I put it up on our YouTube channel description page. They sent an undercover person into these left-wing groups, and what they were doing was they were turning in Palestinians who were thinking about selling their land to Jews in what they call the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria. And they were killed because under Palestinian law, you sell your land to a Jew, they're going to kill you. And so this guy named Nawi, this supposed great left-wing peace activist, was turning people in so they could get killed. And now they're protesting his arrest in Israel. So Israel has a lot of internal trouble. This thing on the news last week, this mother stabbed to death down in one of the settlements, 38 years old, 6 children. Our ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Israel, had some comments about that at a speech that he gave in Israel this week at a security conference, literally the next day after the stabbing took place. This is what Dan Shapiro said.
Yesterday, a young mother of 6, Daphne Meir, Zichrona Livracha, was brutally murdered in her home as she fought to protect her children from a Palestinian terrorist armed with a knife. And today, even as Daphne's family buried her, a young pregnant woman was viciously stabbed and badly wounded by another terrorist. In the face of such outrages, the United States condemns unequivocally these barbaric acts of terrorism, as we believe all others should do.
And that's good, but this the photos of this funeral were just absolutely heartbreaking. At the same time that he's doing this, he's expressing concern over Israel's anti-NGO law. Talked a little bit about that last week. You have to report if you're getting your money from outside, from governments outside. And the U.S. has come out and said, this is just awful. We have worse laws in our country. And if the Democrats had their way, they would overturn the Supreme Court decision that allows people to give unlimited money to PACs. Because that's not fair. But Israel does it, we're going to stand up against it. You know why? Because it's the Jews. That's why. That's really what lies at the heart of this. It's an everlasting hatred, but you need to understand the Jews are the canary in the coal mine. Here's some video from that funeral of that mother. You'll see a picture here of the husband and a number of their children. A lot of Naphtali Bennett and other leaders in the settlement community were there. There's a video of the one daughter, 15 years old, giving a eulogy. It'll rip your heart out. Just a horrible thing. And 6 children. Prime Minister Netanyahu went down there. One of the things he said, I think that everyone who sees Daphne's picture is immediately impressed by the light emanating from within. She was, by all accounts, an extraordinary woman, and stabbed by a terrorist who they've now caught. So Shapiro's speech was, while he did condemn the terrorism, it got very bad, and he and Netanyahu got into it in the press. But this is what he said about Israel.
Now, in light of the events this past weekend, I would like to start by reviewing what these events tell us about the United States strategy and commitments and what we are able to achieve through American diplomatic leadership. If, as it appears, we are in an extended period when there cannot be direct negotiations, we must find ways of preserving the viability of a two-state solution for the future, Israel's only path to avoid becoming a binational state, and arrest negative trends that pull us away from that goal and prevent the terrible violence we have recently seen. Critical questions stand before Israelis and Palestinians, and as one of Israel's closest friends and as the longtime sponsor of peace efforts, we feel a unique responsibility to draw attention to these issues. We are concerned and perplexed by Israel's strategy on settlements. We are concerned and perplexed by Israel's strategy on settlements. We are concerned and perplexed by Israel's strategy on settlements. This government and previous Israeli governments have repeatedly expressed their support for a negotiated two-state solution, a solution that would involve both mutual recognition, separation, and security arrangements. Yet separation will become more and more difficult if Israel plans to...
I'll play a clip responding to that in just a moment. It's actually a clip from 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, but it's, I think, as relevant today as it's ever been. In addition to this, the UN Secretary General came out and also expressed concern over things going on in the West Bank and annexing land. Imagine the horror of Jews living in Israel. What is at stake here? Well, you'll understand from the clip, but I don't have time to go into this report. The EU Council also released something this week, conclusions on the Middle East peace process. They had a number of things. For example, this one, the Council is deeply concerned that the continuing cycle of violence has led to a serious loss of human life in Israel and the Palestinian territory in recent months. The EU firmly condemns the terror attacks and violence from all sides and in any circumstances. The EU calls on political leaders to work together through visible actions to contribute to calm and address the underlying causes of the tensions. The EU recalls the special significance of the holy sites and calls for upholding the status quo put in place in 1967 for the Temple Mount, Al-Haram, Al-Sharif, in line with previous understandings and with respects to Jordan's special role. And it goes on, there's about 9 points in this thing, and it talks about, for example, it concludes near the end with this. There was some talk about they're boycotting Israel by boycotting these things that are made in the West Bank and labeled made in Israel. And they're saying, no, that's not even part of Israel to us. So we're not anti-Israel. We're not boycotting Israel. We're very clever, you see, here in Europe. You can see how clever they are by the way they're handling their immigration issues, right? This does not constitute a boycott of Israel, which the EU strongly opposes. Well, that's what they're doing. It's just so maddening. And it says the EU will continue to support its aspirations, Palestinian aspirations for statehood. Shapiro also talks about the borders. I don't know if I have a sound for this or not. He talks about land swaps. You can see, you can look at this later, how things are going to go. There's also this...
Hovering over all these questions is the larger one about Israel's political strategy vis-a-vis its conflict with the Palestinians. What is Israel's plan for resolving the conflict, for remaining a Jewish and democratic state? And if it judges a political solution to be out of reach for the time being, then what is its plan for managing and stabilizing the conflict in the short and medium term?
The New York Times came out in an editorial saying the fading two-state solution, because this is what the world really wants. And again, I don't have time to go into the prophecy, I think in Ezekiel 35 and 36, that talks about efforts to make a two-state solution because of these people who live in the mountains of Israel, and they appear to get some control over their land, and they're very proud. It's exactly what happened in Gaza. It's going to happen in some fashion, I believe. I think it's talked about in those passages. You can look up Ezekiel 35 and 36 and read it for yourself. The Times editorial said this: Israel is moving quickly to establish facts on the ground that preclude a Palestinian state, leaving Palestinians increasingly marginalized and despairing. It is starting to look like a de facto annexation, one American official said. In a speech last month, Secretary of State John Kerry, we played it here at the Saban Forum, warned that violence, settlement building, and demolitions of Palestinian homes were imperiling the viability of a two-state solution. He said that the number of settlers had increased by tens of thousands in 5 years. Thousands of Palestinian homes are said to be pending demolition. The Palestinian homes have been built illegally. And the increase in population, Daphne Mir had 6 children. All of the settlers have large families, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 children. Their birth rates are off the charts. Their birth rate is higher than the Palestinians. With the Kerry and Shapiro speeches, the administration is hoping to prod Israelis and Palestinians to think hard about the future they are creating, says the New York Times. Tragically, it may already be too late for one formula that has a best chance of establishing a durable peace. 2 independent states side by side, as long as, what? One of the states doesn't have any Jews in it. Read their charter. Mahmoud Abbas, here's a clip from memory. He said this: we welcome every drop of blood spilled in Jerusalem. This is pure blood, clean blood, blood on its way to Allah. I don't have time to play this. I'll try to play this next week. Benjamin Netanyahu talks about it. But I found a clip of a speech from Caroline Glick a few years ago. I think this few minutes kind of summarizes the hub of the problem. So let's listen to Caroline Glick.
The whole issue of whether or not the settlements in Judea and Samaria are somehow or another going to destroy Israel or not is not about demography, and it's not about peace. It's about civil rights. It's about Jewish civil rights. What they are saying essentially is that Jews should not be allowed to live there just because they're Jews. Now, why should Jews be allowed to live in London, live in Germany, live in San Francisco, but not be allowed to live in Judea? Why? And in Jerusalem? Where does this come from? They want to talk so much about Palestinian rights. Let's talk about Jewish rights for a second. You're saying that you so support a Palestinian state that is going to be inherently bigoted and that Jews aren't allowed to even live there, that they have to all be ethnically cleansed first before these people can even deign to accept sovereignty. What kind of state do you want to establish? What kind of nonsense is this? This is a racket. This is a racket. Jews don't have civil rights. We're not allowed to live wherever we have property rights to build just because we're Jewish? And this is a moral argument? This is a reasonable argument? This is establishing what exactly? A state based upon ethnic purity? This is where we've come to in 2013 in the Western world? Where are the liberal values that are being advanced by this cause of a Jew-free Palestine? Somebody can explain this one to me, because I don't understand it. Whose civil rights are advanced by the expropriation illegally of land from Jews and the transfer to the Palestinians? Nobody. Nobody. I tell you what, this is what we're talking about here. You want to know what we're really talking about here when we talk about throwing all these Jews off the lands that we bought that belong to us? We are talking about trying to find common ground with terrorist organizations that are mandated to enact a genocide of the Jewish people. Just read the Hamas covenant. Just see what they say. They call not for only the annihilation, the obliteration, in their words, of the Jewish state, but they call for the genocide of world Jewry. And to try to find common ground with these murderers or with Holocaust deniers like PLO chief Mahmoud Abbas, we have people like Daniel Levy and Mr. Sieghart saying, what? Oh, well, we can agree that there's a subset of Jews that we also dislike, right? Let's call them the settlers and say that they're destroying all prospects for peace. Not Hamas, not Fatah, that are throwing missiles at the homes of, now 3.5 million Jews are in their range from Gaza. No, 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 no. It's because Jews have the temerity to build on land that they own. That's the problem. We can sit down and talk to Hamas because we, like them, hate Jews. Now, we don't hate all Jews, but a subset. And we're going to blame everything, all the pathologies of the Arab world, all the pathologies of the Palestinians, on them. It's their fault. They're going to block peace. Not true. Again, to return to the beginning at the end of my remarks. Israel has 2 peace treaties, one with Jordan, one with Egypt, that are just fine, thank you very much for asking, and they were signed, sealed, and delivered, and maintained while Israel was expanding the Jewish presence in Judea and Samaria and Gaza. We signed 6 agreements with the PLO, again, none of which they've maintained or adhered to, but they were all signed while we were building in Judea and Samaria. How is it that suddenly this is the obstacle to peace? Because you can now find common ground when you all want to delegitimize Israel. Oh, we can all agree that we hate these specific Jews and they should all be thrown out of their houses. This is a moral atrocity. It is morally reprehensible. It is strategically idiotic.
And I will add to this, it is a spiritual battle ultimately. I started off with this. There's no other way to say it. There are demonic forces that are against Israel, because the devil knows Bible prophecy. His demons know Bible prophecy. You can read about that in one of the Gospels. You son of man, you've come to torment us before the time? What's going on here? You shouldn't be doing this yet. They know. And just like there's a principality behind Persia, there's a principality behind these other powers that are doing this, and it's to destroy the Jewish people to prevent the coming of Bible prophecy. And other nations of the world are playing into it. Here is Caroline's article, and I may have these a little bit out of order. Let me just check here. Now, I want to just read a few clips from her article in the Jerusalem Post the other day, Coordinated Assault. Dace and his comrades may or may not be members of terrorist groups. This is the person who stabbed Daphne Meir, that horrible person who took care of 6 children in the area called West Bank, in a Jewish settlement. Obviously, any talk of the peace process in this climate is utter folly. The most Israel can aspire to is to deter the hate-soaked Palestinians from attacking us. This week, U.S. Ambassador Dan Shapiro proved the Palestinians right yet again. At the outset of his speech before the Institute of National Security Studies on Monday, Shapiro issued a pro forma condemnation of barbaric acts of terrorism against Israelis at the outset of his remarks. But that was just clearing his throat. I love the way she writes. By the way, I believe she lives in a settlement down in the West Bank area now. And I've met a couple of these women in my life, and they're extraordinary women. I pray for their salvation. Because they need Jesus, just like we all do. But they're extraordinary women. They are forces of nature. But that was just clearing his throat. In his substantive remarks, Shapiro accused Israel of institutional racism in Judea and Samaria. Shapiro's slanderous accusation channeled and escalated his boss, Secretary of State John Kerry's anti-Israel libel from 2 years ago. In early 2014, Kerry alleged that if Israel didn't cough up Judea, Samaria, and Jerusalem soon, it risked becoming a criminal apartheid state in the future. By falsely alleging that Israel uses one lenient law against Israelis and another iron-fisted law against Palestinians, Shapiro gave substance to Kerry's 2-year-old assault. And in claiming that this state of affairs exists today, he transformed Kerry's incendiary claim of an apartheid future into a defamatory rap sheet for current imaginary offenses. The timing of Shapiro's blood libel was significant for 2 reasons. First, the day after a Palestinian murdered Meir, And hours after another Palestinian stabbed another Jewish mother in the late stages of pregnancy, the U.S. ambassador told the Palestinians that America blames Israel for their barbarism. Shapiro maligned Israel just as the Council of Europe announced it was firming up its rules for labeling Jewish-made products from Judea, Samaria, and Jerusalem, and published a document on its plans for handling a unicorn called the Middle East Peace Process. Both the EU's announcements about labeling Jewish products and its document about the non-existent Middle East peace process were notable for two reasons. First, they made no mention whatsoever of terrorism. As far as Europeans are concerned, the only side preventing peace is Israel, and to bring peace, the EU calls for the Jewish state to be treated like Jews in Europe. That is, singled out for discrimination, abuse, and insults. The government should act forcefully to remove all of the EU-constructed illegal Palestinian settlements in Area C of Judea and Samaria. The place the government should begin demolition is at the illegal Palestinian settlement outside the National Heritage Site of Susia, just kilometers from where Daphne Mir was murdered. The dual purpose of that specific EU-financed illegal building project is to threaten the Israeli communities of Susia and Mitzir Yar and to deny the historic significance of the ancient Jewish city of Susia. So that's what our ambassador talked about. You know, there was a reference in one article that I read this week to a 25-year-ago event where they were going to solve the problems in the Middle East. It was called the Madrid Peace Conference. I have pictures of it. I've used it in presentations before. Bill Koenig talks about it in his book, Eye to Eye. It's very well documented, the timing of everything. Then President Bush 41, went to Madrid. The purpose? Convince Israel to give up its land for peace. While he was at Madrid, 1991, 25 years ago, a very strange event happened. A cold water hurricane that moved backwards, contrary to things, the largest waves, 100-foot waves in the North Atlantic history, almost destroyed the Bush compound at Kennebunkport, Maine, while Bush was in Madrid, forcing Israel to give up land. So this week, our ambassador to Israel, Ron Shapiro, is engaging in even worse accusations against the Israeli people. And it just so happens that an unprecedented snowstorm hits Washington, D.C. Is there a connection? I've often said, coincidence is not a kosher word, but things happen. And I could go on. Caroline also has another article from Tuesday about Israel and the Russia challenge. What's Russia doing? They're giving S-400 missiles. They're establishing air bases in Syria. Israel will no longer have air superiority in the Middle East. It'll be Russia, right on the northern border of Israel. Does that sound like anything? Could be. Go read Ezekiel 38 and 39. Now, some people say Russia's not involved. I don't know. I happen to think it is, but we'll see what happens. Turkey building air bases on the border with Syria. S-400 missiles. Israel's isolated. This is prophetic. This is things unfolding right. And at the same time, Russia is giving weapons and funding to Hezbollah, whose main goal is what? Not the annihilation, not the destruction of the Jewish state, the annihilation of the Jewish people from the planet. All this going on right in front of us. Pay attention, folks. Okay, let's pray. Lord, we pray that in your mercy and grace that you would help as many people to wake up to the reality of the situation that we live in. Lord, give us the boldness to share the gospel with as many people as possible, knowing that at this point we're on a rescue operation for as many people as we can before all these things start to unfold. Lord, I just pray that you will give us wisdom, knowledge, the proper spirit, fill us with your spirit so we know what to do and what to say. And Lord, I just pray that you will watch over the people that are suffering in the east, the northeast now with the snowstorm. Pray you'll protect them physically, and pray that you'll bless us as we go this week. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you.